know, the Korban Pesach, the way it was done was that you joined together with others, and you would calculate, how much meat was there and so on, and you would join together. Normally sacrifices, if you're obligated to bring a sacrifice, you can't say, oh, I'll join that other person. In other words, an obligatory sacrifice, you can't say, oh, I have to bring a sin offering. You have to bring a sin offering. Let's join together one big offering. It doesn't work that way. Or even one medium-sized offering or a small offering, whatever it is. You can't do that. If you have an obligation to bring a sacrifice, and the other person has an obligation, you each have to bring your own sacrifice. So the question is, can you do that with the Korban Chagiga? Can you bring a sacrifice of a Chagiga and join others in their obligation and fulfill your obligation of Chagiga with others? So my initial thought was that, how could you do such a thing? Korban Pesach is a different story. Regular obligatory sacrifice, how could you do such a thing? Now, the Minchas Chinuch actually follows that logic, and he brings in the Mitzvah 88. It's actually not printed in his Minchas Chinuch. It's printed in his additions afterwards that he left out. It's called the Koimetz HaMincha. He has an additional section that he writes there that that he brings from a Rashi in Psachim, that it would seem that Rashi holds that the Korban Chagiga cannot come b'shutfis. It can't be bought as a joint sacrifice. You've brought the Chagiga, you fulfill your obligation. He brings his Chagiga, he has to bring his own sacrifice. Now, doesn't mean you can't eat from each other's sacrifice, but you can't fulfill your Chagiga obligation from your sacrifice. That's the way he seems to understand Rashi in Tractate Psachim. The interesting thing is the Turei Even, who is a popular commentary over here in the Tractate Chagiga, he goes through a whole number of pages trying to prove the opposite. He tries to prove that you are allowed to bring a Korban Chagiga as a partner, and you could both fulfill your obligation. So he brings different proofs to such a idea, and he concludes that you're allowed to. So again, we have the source based on a Rashi that maybe you can't bring it as a partner, and we have a Turei Even that brings proofs that you could. And the interesting thing is that there is a Tosefta, which is printed in the back of the Gemaras. And the Tosefta actually says clearly that you would be allowed to bring this with others. So you can bring it as a partnership. Now, it seems that the Turei Even and the Minchas Chinuch were not aware of this Tosefta, surprisingly. But the Tosefta says that, I'll just read it for you, very short and sweet. It says, what is a Chagiga? These are the shlamim, peace offering that comes for the holiday. If you have from your own, you bring it. If you don't, mishtatefu, you can partner im acherim with others. Ubelvad shelo yivchais mikashir, as long as you don't give less than the obligatory measure, than the measure that you have to give. Each of them have to make sure that it's the measure, the right measure. But you can join your friend in v'zeh v'zeh kruyim chagiga, and both of them will be called chagiga. And so it seems that there's a very clear source that you can bring it as a partner. So it's surprising that maybe they didn't know this or they didn't see this in the Tosefta, but it seems pretty clear that you are able to bring the Chagiga as a shutvis. Now, the Minchas Chinuch was trying to prove from Rashi and Psachim that you can't do this. There may be ways of answering Rashi that Rashi doesn't really say that so clearly. In other words, he's trying to derive it from Rashi, from a hint. So it's not necessarily so. And therefore, we're not going to ask this as a question on Rashi, but it just seems surprising. Maybe the Tur Yevon didn't have the Toseftas. But anyway, you are allowed to bring it as a partner. Yes, Robert. You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, thank you. I just want to distinguish some of the, for me, are the finer points. One is we all were obligated to bring a sacrifice, and the sacrifice meant not only a sacrifice, but I guess, for lack of a better word, officiating. Essentially, there's something to be said in the offering. Now, if you partner with somebody else, whether you don't have a chagiga or you do, but you're still obligated. So somebody is the lead, or each one of you still have the responsibility of being part of the prayer process. Does that make sense to you or to others? So
yeah, the only thing is that the prayer that's recited is the blessing that's recited, and that's probably recited by the person who slaughters it. So it doesn't matter who the owners are.
So it doesn't matter. It's just coming to give the offering. Okay.
And celebrating with this offering.
Okay,
it's part of the celebration, bringing an offering on the holiday. It's part of the holiday celebration is bringing the sacrifice.
So everybody who partners with somebody else is a co-equal in the process.
Right.
And there's a limit of co-equals, or just, again, a finite number of people who can come together to be partners in the process. Is there anything that fixes that?
It seems there's no limit as long as there's the amount of meat for each of them to fulfill their obligation.
Okay, good. I just wanted to get an understanding of that. Yeah.
Yeah,
okay,
for sure. So, so now our Mishnah did say that if a person has a lot of people to feed, they should bring a lot of these shlamim, which we understood to be shalmei chagiga. So the truth of the matter is, the simple way of reading the Mishnah would be that there are many people eating this chagiga sacrifice, and the simple understanding would be they're fulfilling their obligation. The only thing is that you don't have to learn it that way. It could be that they're not fulfilling their obligation. They're just eating the chagiga with you, and you have a big household, but they might be either bringing their own as well, or they might be exempt from bringing, but they still want to participate in yours. And there's a possibility that they would be allowed to eat from your chagiga, even if they themselves might be exempt. And therefore, the Mishnah does not really disprove the option of not being a partner. It could be, you can't really prove it from our Mishnah, but the Tosefta seems to be very clear that your mishtatif, that there it does say it very clearly. Again, our Mishnah maybe hints to it that you can partner up, but it doesn't clearly state it, because you could say it's not a proof from our Mishnah. You could say that, there are others eating with you. You have, you have a lot of people to feed, but yet they're not fulfilling their obligation of chagiga while they're eating this chagiga. But the main proof would be the Tosefta. Yes.
And that number of people essentially is your mishpucha that accompany you, as well as those people you partnered with. There's always the ratio of enough meat relative to the population there. If
they're fulfilling their obligation,
right? Okay.
With that, and if not, then even if they have a tiny thing, you're fulfilling your interest of giving them some meat. But but if they're obligated, so then there would need to be enough. Okay, so that really touches upon now the thing is, the Rambam interestingly doesn't mention this, that you could bring it b'shutfis. The Rambam does not mention that you could bring partnership a chagiga. So that would maybe imply like maybe you can't, because Maimonides writes all these laws of the sacrifices, and he doesn't mention the idea that that you would be able to bring it as a partner. But there is a sefer on the Tosefta called Chazon Yechezkel from Rabbi Yechezkel Abramsky, and he explains that the fact that the Rambam doesn't bring it is simply because it's obvious. Why is it so obvious? So he says a very interesting thing. He says, if you think about the statement of our Gemara that you could buy one big animal, and some of the money would be consecrated money, and as long as you have the minimum amount of unconsecrated money to fulfill your obligation, that's fine. You have one animal. Some of it is consecrated money that is being used. In other words, Meiser Sheni money. It's money that is really, you have an obligation anyway to bring it, to eat from that money in Jerusalem and rejoice with that money. And you could use that as part of your Chagiga sacrifice, as long as you have a little unconsecrated money, the minimum measure that you need, and then you fulfill your obligation of the Chagiga of this sacrifice, this holiday sacrifice. So he says, think about that. If you could fulfill your obligation with part of an animal, so why can't someone else be a partner? In other words, according to that law, it would be obvious that you could have a partner as well, because all that law is really teaching us is all you need is part of an animal. You don't need the full animal for your chagiga. You could have part of an animal for your chagiga. The rest of it could be consecrated funds, and it's kosher. It's a good chagiga. So he says the Rambam doesn't write that you can have a partner, because it's obvious if you could use consecrated funds and you're only basically having part of your animal is unconsecrated and it's good enough for your fulfillment of the chagiga. He says you could have a partner as well, because he's using part of the animal for his unconsecrated funds, and you're using your unconsecrated funds. You're having part of an animal. It's a kosher chagiga. So he says that's why the Rambam doesn't bring it. That's quite an insight based on our Gemara and answering the Rambam. Okay, so that I guess sort of like answers the issue. And I will just mention that he does say that the reason why the Tosefta says this whole thing is because you would think that you could not be a partner, just like a chatas, a sin offering, you have an obligation to bring, or an asham, you have an obligation to bring a guilt offering. You would not be able to have a partner in it. And here it is a unique law that it is allowing partnership, and it doesn't follow the norm of obligatory sacrifices. Okay, going back to our Gemara now. So the Gemara that we did yesterday, the new Gemara from yesterday, was on page 8b, and maybe about 20 lines from the bottom of the page. And the Gemara had said that Ula brought a statement from Reish Lakish that if a person separates 10 animals, excuse me, if a person separates 10. If a person separates 10 animals from for his Chagiga, again, all you really need is one, but he's separating 10 and he's using them for his Chagiga sacrifice. And if he brought 5 on one day, he can go and bring another 5 on the next day. Rabbi Yochanan says, once you stop, you cannot bring any more. And the way we explained it yesterday was Rashi's interpretation, and that is that it would be an Isser, a prohibition of Bal Tosef. Now, the Gemara says that it's not really an argument because there's a difference between Stam and Mefarish. Stam means simple, simply done, and unspecified. And Mefarish means where you specify, where you explain what it's specifically meant for. Now, the Gemara doesn't understand that what that refers to. So the Gemara asks, the Gemara says, was there time to bring more and you didn't? Or was there no time? If there was no time to bring the rest of the sacrifices, the sun set. So then, this that you didn't bring it was not because you voluntarily chose not to bring these sacrifices. You were stuck. So being stuck, not being able to bring the Chagiga sacrifice on that day should not limit you, should not make it be considered a Bal Tosef, someone who's adding mitzvahs by bringing it the next day, because you didn't voluntarily choose to do this. So it must be, the Gemara says, maybe you didn't have enough people to eat from those other sacrifices. And the reason why you didn't sacrifice all 10, you only did 5, was because you got nervous that if you slaughter all 10, the people will not end up eating all the meat, and you're going to cause it to become what's called nicer, left over, and that is also a prohibition that you're not supposed to leave over, and so therefore you stopped bringing the rest of the sacrifices on the first day. But the Gemara says, but if that's so, then you didn't voluntarily choose not to bring the other sacrifices. You didn't bring it because you don't have anyone to eat it. So the Gemara then says it must be that we're talking about a case where you did have more time and you could have brought, and you did have people to eat it, and you could have brought these other 5, and you voluntarily chose not to. And if that's the case, then you would not be allowed to bring it more anymore, because, in other words, on the other days, because you voluntarily chose not to do it, and you will be transgressing the prohibition of Bal Tosef, which means Bal Tosef, you can't add anything, any mitzvah or anything to the mitzvahs, and by adding this other day to Chagiga, you're adding a day to the Chagiga, which was not part of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to celebrate one day of Chagiga. In other words, to bring a sacrifice of Chagiga on one day. You want to bring more than one sacrifice, you can, as long as you do it all on the same day. But if you voluntarily choose to do on a different day, it's like bringing 5. It's like putting 5 tzitzis on your talis instead of 4. It's like adding something to a mitzvah, and you would be transgressing Bal Tosef. However, if you specifically specify that these 10 sacrifices are for the Chagiga on the first day, so if you did that, you said these are for the first day, and then you voluntarily stopped bringing them, then we have the statement of Reish Lakish that says, you could go and bring them on another day. Why? because you established them to be for the first day, and for whatever reason, you're not bringing them on the first day, they're still called first day sacrifices, and you're able to sort of like do a makeup. So in other words, the question here is, are we calling this a makeup for the first day, or are we calling this you're voluntarily choosing to bring them on the second day? And what comes out is that if you couldn't bring them on the first day, we don't care if you called all 10 chagigas of the first day or not. You might have just said these are all chagigas and you didn't say they're for the first day, but you couldn't end up bringing them on the first day because of time or because of people, you didn't have enough people. In that case, when you do bring them on the next day, we're calling it a makeup of the first day. Why are we calling it a makeup of? You never called them first day chagigas, but the fact is, because you weren't able to bring it on the first day, we can call it a makeup for the first day, and it's not called a bal toisif. We're not considering it an addition, an adding to the mitzvahs. However, if you voluntarily did not bring them on the first day, so then, it'll depend if you specify these are for the first day, or if you didn't specify and it's called stam. They're unspecified for the first day. And in that case, if you didn't specify they're for the first day and you voluntarily didn't bring them on the first day, then you're adding a mitzvah to the Torah. You're doing something, you're bringing a second chagiga, second day of chagiga, which is not a mitzvah. However, if you did specify that they're all for the first day, and then you voluntarily chose not to bring them on the first day, we still will be able to consider it a makeup for the first day because these are first day sacrifices. You didn't bring them on purpose, by mistake. Okay. Now, when you want to bring them on the second day, they are a makeup because they're officially first day sacrifices, and that would be acceptable. So that's Reish Lakish's law is a chidush, is something innovative because he's telling us something we wouldn't have known, that if you voluntarily chose not to bring them on the first day, since you specified them, you can bring them on another day and it's not bal tosef. Rabbi Yochanan is telling us that if you didn't specify them and you voluntarily chose to leave them over, then you will not be able to bring them on the other days because it'll be considered bal tosef. This is the way Rashi is learning this Gemara. Now the Gemara on 5-6 lines up from the bottom, v'hachi nami mistabra. And this also is mistaber, it's logical to say. That when you specify, Rabbi Yochanan would agree that it'll work. So v'hachi nami mistabra d'chi asa Ravin, because when Ravin came to Bavel, in other words, Ravin traveled from Eretz Yisrael, from Israel to Bavel. So when Ravin came, Amar, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and as we know, Rabbi Yochanan lived in Eretz Yisrael, and Rabbi Yochanan was in Tiberia, and Ravin came, he said that Rabbi Yochanan had said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Hifresh Eser Behemais L'Chagigasa, if a person separated 10 animals for his Karban Chagiga, his holiday sacrifice, but he didn't bring them all. Hikrev Chamesh, he brought 5 of them. B'Yom Tov Rishon on the first day. Chayzer Makrev Chamesh B'Yom Tov Sheni. He can go and bring the other 5. Now that doesn't seem to fit with Rabbi Yochanan's statement earlier. Before, a few lines earlier, we had Rabbi Yochanan seemingly arguing on Reish Lakish, but the Gemara explains he wasn't arguing, but he said very clearly that you can't bring the other five. Kivan shapasak shuv einoi makriv. Those were his words. Since you stopped on the first day, you can't bring them anymore on the other days. So how does that fit with his statement that we heard from Ravin, that Ravin had said that you could bring them? So kasha nardodi, it's a question, contradiction, one to the other. Elalav shmamina. Rather, we hear from this. Kan bistam, kan b'mafaresh. That here we're talking about stam, where you didn't specify that they're first day sacrifices. Since you didn't specify that they're first day sacrifices, if you go and bring it again, and a different day, bring the other five, you will end up transgressing Bal Tosef, adding on a mitzvah. Kan b'mafarish here is when you specify that these are first day sacrifices, then even though you voluntarily didn't bring it on the first day, it's still considered a makeup for the first day, and it will not be a problem of Bal Tosef Shma Mina. We hear from this that this is the meaning, this is the understanding of Rabbi Yochanan's statement, and it comes out that it's not an argument on Reish Lakish. They're both talking about different cases, and as Rabbi Abba had told us, as Rabbi Abba had explained. The Gemara continues and says, Itmar Nami, it was also said in the Beis Medrash, similarly, Amar Reb Shemen ben Abba bar Abba, Amar Reb Yochanan. Reb Shemen bar Abba said in the name of Reb Yochanan. And now we turn to page 9a. Loishanu, this was not learned. Ela shaloi gamar, only in a case. Let me preface before I conclude the statement that Rabbi Shemen bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that the brisa that says that you can only bring the Chagiga on the Yom Tov Rishon, it says v'chagoysa ma'aseh chag l'Hashem, that oisa, you celebrate it, means one day, and you can't celebrate it all 7 days. So this, that it says that you can only celebrate the Chagiga on the first day, loishanu, it was not learned, ella shaloi gamar, only in a case of loy gamar. We'll soon see what loy gamar is. But that's the meaning, that's the circumstances, that's the situation that the Bryce is talking about, that you can only bring it on the first day, is a case of loy gamar. Aval im gamar, but if gamar, whichever, what we'll soon see what that means, chayzer umakriv, then you would be able to bring it on other days that are after the first day. So the Gemara says, so what does this gamar mean? My gamar. What is gamar? Gamar literally means completed, but what does it mean completed? If it was completed, if what was completed? So, ilema, if you want to say that gamar means gamar korbanaisav, that gamar means he finished bringing all the sacrifices, and in that case, where you finished bringing all the sacrifices, so what would it mean? Chayzer umakriv, you could go and finish bringing your sacrifices. Gamar means you finished. My makriv, what are you bringing? I thought you finished bringing all your sacrifices. So gamar, which means he finished, he concluded, can't mean he concluded sacrificing all the sacrifices, because then what does it mean? Im gamar chayzer umakriv, if you've completed, you can go and bring the rest. There are no rest. You finished all of them. So Ella, rather, what does gamar mean? It means shaloi gamar hayoim, that the day was not completed. That's what it means, that you can only bring the sacrifices on the first day of the holiday, the sacrifice Chagiga, you can only bring the rest of the first of the sacrifices of the first day Chagiga is Shaloi Gomar Hayoim, is if the day did not end and you voluntarily chose to stop bringing the rest of these sacrifices. Then you can't choose another day to bring them. Aval Gomar Hayoim, but if the day ended and you weren't able to finish bringing all of your Chagiga sacrifices, Chayzer Umakriv, then you could go back and bring the rest on a different day, because the really first day sacrifices, you simply didn't have enough time. So in other words, it's not a problem of Bal Tosef, because you are really just doing a makeup, a tashlumen for the first day. You can't choose another day to bring it, but you could do a makeup of the first day because you didn't have enough time, and this is a makeup. They're meant for the first day. You simply did not have enough time to bring them. So that's the conclusion of this Gemara, and we're up to the next Mishnah here. However, I do want to mention that there is another way of learning this Gemara. The way we learned it it's all about the prohibition of Bal Tosef. That is Rashi's way of learning. The other way of learning is Tosfos. Tosfos brings Rabbeinu Hananel. And Rabbeinu Hananel has a interpretation here. It's in the bottom Tosfos on page Ches Amud Beis, on page 8b. And Tosfos' way of learning this whole discussion of the Gemara is about bringing a Chagiga on the last day, which is Yom Tov. If you didn't bring the Chagiga on the first day of Yom Tov, would you be, now, of course, you could do it on the other days of Yom Tov, but could you do it on the last day, which is a holiday? And the Tosfos is Chayzer Umakriv Chamesh B'Yom Tov Sheni, that you would go and bring the other 5 on the Yom Tov Sheni. Doesn't mean the second day of Yom Tov. It would mean Yom Tov Sheni. That means Yom Tov Ha'acharei in the end, the Yom Tov, the actual holiday, the holiday when you're not allowed to do work. Would you be allowed to bring it on the end of Yom Tov on the holiday? Shmini Atzeres would be the question. Would you be allowed to bring it on Shmini Atzeres? Now, you're normally not allowed to bring sacrifices that are nidarim in nedavos on Yom Tov, extra voluntary sacrifices. Here you're bringing 10 animals for the Chagiga. You brought 5 on the first day. You want to bring the other 5 on the last day of Yom Tov. Now, there is room to say that since you started bringing them as a Chagiga on Yom Tov, on the first day of Yom Tov, you should be allowed to bring them afterwards as a tashlumen for the first days. In other words, for your original Chagiga. And it's not considered a neder, a vow. These are considered Chagigas. Rabbi Yochanan says once you stopped, you can't bring the rest because they would be considered not Chagigas, they would be considered more like voluntary offerings. And Reb Abba says they're not arguing. He says there's a difference if it's stam or if it's mefarish. If you didn't specify anything or if you specified. Rabbi Yochanan says you cannot bring them on the other days of the last day, which is Yom Tov, because you separated it stam. You said this is chagigas. You didn't say that you want to bring them on a certain day, and you brought 5 of them on the first day, and you still have time to bring them, according to the conclusion of the Gemara, you have time to bring them on the first day, and you didn't, and you have people who would eat them on the first day, and you didn't slaughter them, and you left them. So what we are going to consider them to be is nedarim and nedavais. These are like voluntary sacrifices, because you could have brought them on the first day, and we would have considered them chagiga sacrifices. But now that you didn't, so you can't bring them on the last day, because we don't bring voluntary sacrifices on a holiday. We'll bring them on the intermediate days, but we don't bring them on the holiday. Now, Reish Lakish is talking about a case where you were mafaresh, that you said you want these to be brought, these sacrifices, and you said that Shapir, I'm just going to read it inside. Udereish Lakish, Kagoin Shapiresh, She'elu Hanisharim Yakrivim B'Yom Tov Ha'achrei. If you specified that these sacrifices that are left over, you're going to be bringing them on the last day, Kagoin Zeh Mutter, in such a case, this would be permissible to bring them on the last day, because they are clearly separated to be brought on the last day as chagigas. And we're not going to exclude them from being considered a chagiga. And the Gemara then says that this is also mistabra, and because when Ravin came and he said that Rabbi Yochanan said you separated 5 for his chagiga, you could bring the other 5 on Yom Tov Sheni, and it sounds like a contradiction. And the answer is that if you separated them on the condition that you're going to bring them as sacrifices on the last day, so we will consider it a chagiga, and you would be allowed to bring them on the last day. And then the Gemara says that Reb Shemin bar Abba, just going through the entire piece of the Gemara, it says Reb Shemin bar Abba says about this loishanu, that it was only learned in a case shaloi gamar and all that. So what does this mean? So when it says that Reb Shemin bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that since you stopped from bringing them on the first day, you can't bring them anymore, that is in a case where the day did not end and you still had time. And then we say, since you didn't bring them on the first day, so even though you had time, obviously you were leaving it over. And then we're not going to allow you to bring them on the last days, because they're going to be considered like voluntary sacrifices that cannot be brought on a day of an actual holiday. But if the day ended and you didn't have time, you wanted to bring them on the first day, then you would be allowed to bring them even on another holiday, even on the last day, because this that you didn't bring them, it's not because you're considering it a neder or nadava, a vow, you're considering it a chagiga. And that's the way Rabbeinu Hananel learns the entire flow of our Gemara until the Mishnah. So that's an alternative shot, that it is not a problem of Baal Tosef, it's a problem of bringing a voluntary sacrifice on Yom Tov. Again, on Yom Tov, they, of course, even on Shabbos, they do bring sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash, and on Yom Tov, there are many sacrifices that you could bring on in the Beis HaMikdash, but voluntary sacrifices, of course, it's a whole discussion in the Gemara Beya about bringing voluntary sacrifices on Yom Tov, but that's the understanding of this Gemara is based on that assumption that you would not be allowed to bring Nidarim and Nedavos on a Yom Tov. So that's what our Gemara is wondering. Would these be considered a Neder and Nedava? Would they be considered voluntary sacrifices, or would they be considered Chagiga sacrifices? So that's basically the question, and it would depend on if you specified that you are going to be bringing these Chagigas as Chagigas, or if you didn't specify, which means you were sort of like leaving them over to be considered like voluntary sacrifices. Okay, so that's the two ways of learning, two ways of learning our Gemara. And now we are up to the next Mishnah. So we're on page 9a. We're on the fourth line where it says Mem Tuf Nun Yud, which stands for Masnisin, a Mishnah. And this Mishnah talks about if a person did not bring any sacrifice on the first day, would he be able to do a makeup? So let's learn the Mishnah. Misha loy chag, person who didn't bring his chagiga sacrifice on the first day of the holiday, b'yom tov harishon shel chag, first day of the holiday of Sukkot, choygeg es kol haregel, he can bring this sacrifice any of the days of the holiday. It's not a problem. He's still allowed to bring it. There is such a concept of our yoymei batel karbonai. Like, for example, if you miss a bringing, if on Shabbos they missed bringing a korban musaf, you can't go, well, you wouldn't be able to bring it on another day. You missed the bring, let's say you didn't bring your Tamid, the morning sacrifice. So once it's missed, it can't be made up. Of our Yomei Batel Karbonai, it can't be made up. But here, if you miss the Chagiga sacrifice on the first day, which is the ideal, the preferable time to bring it, you would be able to bring it on the other days. And now the Mishnah tells us something really interesting, that you could even bring it on Shmini Atzeres. The Yom Tov Ha'achron Shel Chag, and you could bring it on the last day of Sukkot, which means Shmini Atzeres. Now in America, we have Simchas Torah. Outside of Israel, we have Simchas Torah, which is the last day, which you would really call the last day. But in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim, where you're bringing the sacrifice, the last day of Sukkot is Shmini Atzeres. They don't have a second day. And there, the day would be Shmini Atzeres, which would, which the Mishnah tells us something that you might not automatically assume, and that is that you could actually bring the Chagiga for Sukkot on Shmini Atzeres. Now, Shmini Atzeres, on the one hand, is considered like a separate holiday. So you may say, I missed the Chagiga of Sukkot. How could I go and bring it on a separate holiday? But that is what the Mishnah tells us, that in a certain sense, it's not separate. In the sense of Chagiga, we will consider it part of the first of the holiday of Sukkot. Now, the Gemara then says, what happens if you miss the Mishnah? See, the Mishnah says, what happens if you miss bringing it even on that day? Of our Haregel, if let's say the whole holiday ends, the loy chag, and you didn't bring this Chagiga sacrifice. Einoi chayev bi'achriyuso, you do not have responsibility to bring it anymore, which means that you're exempt. The al-zenem, on this, it is stated, M'uvas lo yuchal liskoy, a crookedness that cannot be fixed. It's too late. V'chisaron lo yuchal lehimonos, and something that's missing that cannot be counted in. You have no makeup. This is one of those things. There are a lot of things you could make up, but there are certain things you can't. And one of those things would be missing bringing this positive mitzvah of bringing a chagiga, and you missed out on it, and you can't make it up. You could bring one next holiday, but you can't make this up. It's called a me'uvas lo yuchal liskoin, It's a crookedness that you can't have a takana. There's no fixing. Now, the Mishnah continues and says, Reb Shimon ben Menasya Omer, Reb Shimon ben Menasya says, Eizehu mu'uvas she'enu yochel lihisake. What is a crookedness that can't be corrected? So he says, Zehaba al ha'erva. This refers to a person who has relations that are prohibited. Baal ha'erva, someone who's he commits incest. He comes on someone who's prohibited to him. V'hoiled mimena mamzer, and he gives birth from this woman who he's not allowed to be with. He gives birth to a mamzer, to a bastard. And since he gave birth to this child, there is no way of fixing this sin, because in a certain sense, how will tshuva even help? The mamzer is here. Now, Tosfos seems to say that there is nothing that stops tshuva. Tosfos doesn't clearly say it, but the Tosfos Harosh explains it a little better, that there's nothing that tshuva won't help against. So what he means, what the Mishnah means is that, in other words, you could always do tshuva. But what the Mishnah means is that the mamzer, mute everyone here. The mamzer is always there, and it'll always be an embarrassment, a place of you can't fix that. The mamzer is there. Wherever you go, he's in front of you. It's not like if you stole or if you murdered someone. So it's not like, person's not around. The gzela is not. But here, the mamzer is in the world. He's here in the world, and so wherever you go, you see him, and or wherever you see him, it's a reminder. So your embarrassment is always there, and there is no fixing up of that. There's no full fix. There's no complete fix for this. Now, im taimar begoina v'goizel. Now, what about stealing? Stealing, maybe you'll say, well, you stole or goizel, or you robbed. You held up. Goizel is more of a in the open. You held someone up with a gun. Yachol hulach ziroi. There, you could say that you could return it v'yisakein and fix the sin. But here, you wouldn't be able to. How do you return a mamzer? He's alive. Now, Reb Shimon ben Yochai says, "Ein kairin me'uvas ela lamisha hayam asukin betchila v'nesaves." You don't call this crooked. Only someone who started out straight, correct, good, and became crooked. So if you really want to translate the verse on a sin, you want to explain the verse to refer to a sin of something that you made crooked and now you can't fix. Be'ezeh, who would this be? Zeh Talmud Chacham. This would be a scholar that is a Pirish min HaTorah, that left Torah. And the other cases are not exactly Mu'uvas she'enu yachal liskoin. They're not exactly fitting this verse, because the other cases, there could be the person was a sinner all along, and now he did this sin, but he was always crooked. Here, person was a person who studied Torah, and you could say that maybe he so he was righteous, and now what ended up happening is that he left. So he was righteous and he left. This would be a case of someone who is mu'uvas, who really became crooked and straightened himself out. Now, what does this mean? He left Torah. Why can't he do tshuva? So one of the explanations is because once you miss that time, you can never make up time. So with Torah, there's no making up time, and the other point is that it's the other point of the fact that it's referring to someone who learned Torah is that if he left Torah at the end of his life, so he was righteous all along, he left Torah, and then he passed away. So he never had a chance, or he didn't. It's a mu'uvas lo yochel liskain if he didn't make it up, if he didn't come back. The interesting thing is Reb Shimon ben Yochai is missing an aleph. Why do we spell Reb Shimon ben Yochai throughout the Gemara without the aleph? And one of the answers I once heard many years ago, or maybe, yeah, I once heard a pshat that the gematria of Yedid Nefesh fits with Reb Shimon ben Yochai, that Reb Shimon ben Yochai was the Yedid Nefesh of Hashem, was the so to speak, the close friend of Hashem. And therefore they skip the aleph, because if you leave out the aleph, it somehow equals the gematria of Yedid Nefesh. That's an interesting insight. So it is surprising that the Gemara leaves out the aleph. So maybe that's the reason. Okay, so now the Gemara over here mentions that how do we know that you would be allowed to bring the Chagiga on the day of Shmini Atzeres? That's definitely a little surprising to us. It's not really Sukkot. It's really a holiday of its own. It's called Shmini Atzeres. But although it is interesting that we do call it the 8th day, what is the 8th to? The 8th continuation from the 7th, right? So in a certain sense, it does seem like it has some connection. But on the other hand, it is considered a holiday of its own. So the Gemara says, Menahani Mili, how do we know that you would be allowed to bring this Chagiga on this Yom Tov Acharon, on the last day on Shmini Atzeres? If you, again, we're talking about you missed out, you didn't bring it on the first day, you're going to be allowed to bring it as a makeup on Shmini Atzeres. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, Nemer Atzeres b'Shvi'i shel Pesach. It says Atzeres on the last day of Pesach, b'Yom HaShvi'i Atzeres, on the 7th day, when it talks about Pesach, it says b'Yom HaShvi'i Atzeres la'Hashem Elokecha, lo yisaseh malacha, don't do work, right? It's a day to, so that is considered, so that is the last day of Pesach that you're not allowed to do work on. And of course, we celebrate 2 days because in the diaspora, it's Sveika D'Yoma. It's considered a question what day it is. But the pasuk in the Torah talks about 1 day. On the 7th day of Pesach is Atzeres la'Hashem Elokecha lo yisaseh malacha. So it says Atzeres by Pesach. Benemer Atzeres b'Shmini shel Chag, and it says Atzeres by the 8th day of Sukkot, and it says Atzeresi kol melechas avoda lo yisasu ma lahalon l'tashlumin afkan l'tashlum. Just like there, you could use it as a makeup. Here also, we're going to use it as a makeup. Yes, Ezra.